In this episode, we'll be using heavy-bodied acrylic paints and the Zorn palette to paint UrbanMechs for Catalyst Game Labs' tabletop miniatures game Battletech. The color scheme is inspired by Euterpe's 1919 serigraph New Bridges for the Seven Seas and the smooth gradients of Cassandra's advertisements. We'll discuss the palette, painting process, and inspirations after the story, followed by a brief discussion of the story itself. I hope you enjoy the tale. The Cyclops stood just within the tree line. Thick, angular sections of fragile RAM padding shadowed its frontal armor plating while light netting shrouded its harsh lines. Its systems were cool, a standby power supply running just enough juice to operate the weighty communication and tacticon systems it sported. 12 kilometers of flat field separated it from the edge of Euterpe's nascent industrial works. 2 low-band sensor arrays, each positioned at distance on either side of the city, and likewise hidden at the broad forest edge that wrapped the city in a gentle arc, pulsed to life and beamed their first packets of information to the mech. Euterpe's security forces would no doubt pick up the array's probing scans, but moments from now they'd be far too distracted to investigate them. Jasper was as calm as he could force himself to be. When Hoskins had tapped him for the mission, the lean, gray-haired veteran with agitated eyes made it clear to the young pilot what his role would be. Disappointed at what amounted to little more than lookout duty, Jasper nevertheless understood the opportunity he was being afforded, and knew as well he was being tested. The cautious Hoskins rarely recruited outside of his own tight circle of trusted jockeys. That Jasper was being requested by name from the company's pool of novitiates suggested that Hoskins was looking to expand that circle, if only slightly. Even the best mech warriors eventually met their end, whether in a mech or out of it, and Hoskins knew well enough the importance of new blood. A proximity warning sprung silently to life, and Jasper jerked in his seat. The first time it had happened, he nearly threw the mech to life to obliterate what turned out to be a strange, 6-legged horse thing that was wandering the brush, possibly following the trail the Cyclops had quietly made through the woods. During the almost 5 days he had been waiting in the motionless mech, quite the parade of wildlife had passed through the sensor ring set up around him, so much so that Jasper spent much of his time sitting on the mech's head in the open, rather than constantly going in and out to put eyes on the culprit. It was quiet enough he could usually hear whatever critter was roaming about before he could see it or it enter the ring. With country as inviting as what he found himself in, combined with the isolation of continuous radio silence, it was hard for the young man to not take advantage of it. The soft fields of wild grasses a full meter tall, and the silent, drowsy, late summer air were a far cry from the company barracks. Jasper felt his pulse spike as his eyes picked up shifting movement ahead and to the right of the mech, behind the stillness of low canopy branches. If all went well, Hoskins' lance would have little actual use for Jasper. From what information the tight-lipped veteran had given him, it seemed that the city's combat mech forces were extremely light and amounted to a handful of UrbanMechs. The pains they had taken to remain hidden in both their landing planetside and approach to Euterpe meant the UMs and their pilots would be slow to respond to the sudden strike. With luck, Hoskins and his team would be in and out before the UMs arrived. What their target was, Jasper wasn't privy to. That Hoskins was leading the mission himself, however, told the pilot it was something juicy, and that meant a high probability of what Hoskins called unexpected guests. A man appeared from behind the branches. He sported a well-worn pair of overalls, heavy work boots, and a dirty checkered button-up with rolled-up sleeves. A broad-rimmed, shapeless hat perched far back on his head, and a small satchel was slung over his shoulder. One hand held a long walking stick, the other swung loosely at his side. It hadn't occurred to Jasper that humans would find the lonely tree line far from the city as inviting a place for a stroll on a day off as the local wildlife did. He gripped the firing stick with a shaking hand and reached for the mech's ignition switch. A quiet, double ping came in through the comms. Jasper quickly scanned the information pouring in from the sensor arrays before returning with a slower double ping of his own. All clear. No mechs. Just a man out for a walk, Jasper told himself. Nothing he can do even if he does look up and see you. Better to pull back and quietly disappear than make yourself known, Hoskins had said. Do not engage unless I order you to, or you need to fight your way out. Your role is solely to provide us with situational awareness. Understood? Jasper understood well enough that it wasn't his safety Hoskins was concerned with. The company's lone Cyclops was all but irreplaceable. The pilot forced his hands away from the sticks and console. In the industrial works far ahead of him, something exploded, the flash quickly lost in the bright sunlight. The man below turned to look at the city and the coil of black smoke unfolding into the sky. Jasper breathed a sigh of relief. Undoubtedly, the figure would now race back home or wherever he came from to find out what had happened and see if anyone he knew was hurt. Euterpe wasn't the kind of place where things frequently blew up. Instead of running back, however, the figure turned around and looked up, directly at Jasper through the canopy. He smiled. What? The figure raised the hand not holding the walking stick as if to wave. Jasper's eyes went wide as he spied the detonator. No! Jasper's shout was cut off as a small blast shutted up the Cyclops' frame, the comm system exploding with sparking discharge. The standby generator's soft hum cut out, as did the pair of small, ancillary comm units. Jasper's panicking hand flipped the mech's ignition switch. Nothing. He tried it again. Still nothing. The mech was quiet, save for the pounding of his chest. Below him, the man dropped the detonator and stick and sauntered towards the towering Cyclops. Sax hummed an old litany tune as he climbed the mech's exterior. He couldn't remember the words very well. Something about a black-eyed cat and a straw-haired girl. A dusty song from a dusty world Sax hadn't laid eyes on for many years. At least, not while awake. Like the straw-haired girl, the world of litany had a habit of finding you in your sleep to remind you of all you had lost. Reaching the bottom of the great round canopy, he slung an arm through the last ring for support and fished out his probe mirror. Armored as the canopy was, you could never be too sure. The young pilot inside was holding a pistol and looked terrified, which was to be expected. Sax eased his head into view by the pilot's foot so the youth didn't panic, let loose a shot and injure himself with a ricochet. Sax smiled at the kid. The kid didn't smile back. Sax moved up a few rungs and fully into sight, level now with the midpoint of the canopy. He pointed at the pilot, then up above and behind him to the Cyclops' top hatch. The kid shook his head violently. Sax raised his index finger a moment, then reached into his satchel with a free hand. He pulled out a tightly wrapped object and waggled it at the kid. The pilot's face went ashen. Sax gripped the edge of the adhesive strip's backing with his teeth, peeled it off, and spat it out. He then gently pressed the brick of high explosives against the canopy before turning back to the mech's occupant. He pointed to the mech's top hatch again. The youth paused for a goodly length before giving his head another rough shake. Sax raised his index finger again before unhooking one overall strap from his waist, playing it out as far as the adjustment strap allowed, and looping it over the harness rail across the top of the canopy mech techs used while working on the cockpit's exterior, tying it off around itself. You could never be too sure, after all. Still humming, he edged his way across the canopy to the other side, feet sliding across the bottom rail, before reaching into his satchel and pulling out another brick of explosives. Sax waggled it, pulled off the adhesive backing as he had with the last, affixed it to the canopy, and motioned again to the kid towards the top hatch. Another pause. This time, the pilot nodded. He turned and started up the ladder. Sax rapped on the armored glass. When the kid faced him, Sax pointed at the gun still in his hand and shook his head. The kid hesitated before tossing it on the seat. Sax smiled and gave him a thumbs up. He was waiting with a pistol of his own as the pilot emerged. On seeing the gun, the kid tensed, but a small shrug from Sax and another smile put the young man in a semblance of ease. The two stood silently on the top of the Cyclops for a few moments before the awkwardness set the pilot to smile sheepishly and try to fill the space between him and his captor. Well, I guess, he began. Sachs shot him between the eyes before he got any further. The heavy slug snapped the pilot's head back, and he fell off the backside of the Cyclops, pinwheeling off a protruding comms array with a sharp crack before landing in an untidy heap on the forest floor. When the echoes of the weighty discharge died off, Sachs stepped over to the edge, drew a bead on the corpse below, and shot it twice more to be sure. His job done, Marsden Sachs made himself comfortable on the Cyclops' head, sitting high on its brow, legs dangling, one overall strap tied off to an anchor eyelet. From his satchel he pulled out a sandwich and small flask, setting himself to an early lunch as he watched the final acts of destruction play out in the distance before him. Though he'd never openly admit it, Deshiman enjoyed the brutal pleasure of crushing ground vehicles and unarmored soldiers beneath his heavy treads much more than a fight with other mechs. A mech was a god of death and destruction, and nowhere was that more apparent than in the indiscriminate slaughter of the weak. To fight another mech was to fight another god, a test of strength and cunning, will and resolve. It was to fight an equal. Where was the power in that? Or the fun? Unfortunately, while the city's defenders offered plenty to the Wasp's altar of sacrifice, there was little time to indulge in them. In and out, Hoskins had said, cold eyes boring into Deshi's warm, liquid ones. No time to play. Hence the Wasp and his role of courier to keep his bloodlust down. Still, there were plenty of opportunities to kick a few lighter vehicles or punch an armored fist through a weapons team lurking at a building's lower floor windows as he ran by, or when the latter tried to surround him as he tore into recently finished structures hunting EM spikes. They had struck on a day of rest, a local high holiday when construction crews would be at home or in celebration, and where the only power signatures of note in the area would be security and containment systems that were continuously running. Jasper's passive scans told the team the general areas of where to look, based on day-night EM density fluctuations, but it was up to Deshi and Hoskins to do the digging up close where they could get clearer reads while Spencer and Fuller roamed the largely empty city streets, dealing with any token defense forces that showed up. Deshi carved the Wasp's medium laser through the light chassis of a wheeled truck with a careless sweep as it rocketed around the intersection beside him, slicing it in two before it could bring its autocannon to bear. With another sweep, he cut through the supports of a large rolling door, bull-rushing his way through the weakened corrugated steel and into another high-ceilinged, empty warehouse. Empty, that is, save for a curiously shrouded corner. He focused the Wasp's scans, and the readout lit up. Gotcha. Deshi strode over to the wide, hanging sheet, striped with signs of warning and danger, and, gripping it in one of the Wasp's mighty hands, tore it away, revealing the gaping maw of a large-bore autocannon aimed directly at his cockpit. Deshiman shrieked aloud and dove aside as the UrbanMech opened up. The Wasp bounced off a half-built tower in a hasty, graceless attempt at a hard turn in the narrow confines of a two-lane street. Instead of striking him in the back and obliterating what was left of his mech, the trio of massive heap rounds vaporized what remained of the tower, throwing flaming chunks of scaffolding and concrete 100 paces in all directions. Deshi wiped away the sweat streaming into his eyes and mudding his vision as the sweltering, miasmic air inside his cockpit pulled another racking cough from his lungs. The last hit set something on fire that, by the smell of it, was best kept away from open flames. He punched an emergency release button to pop his external vents and open the cockpit to open air, but nothing happened. A frantic search found they were already open and simply weren't venting fast enough. That was bad. The Wasp's console flashed an angry orange. The fusion reactor's failsafes had been damaged. That was very bad. Deshi spotted the trooper with just enough time to punch his jump jets and avoid the infernal missile, but not soon enough to clear the building in front of him. The foot of his mech caught the penthouse and jerked him face first into the roof. The momentum somersaulted the 20-ton mech to the other side, landing it hard on its back. The last thought to pass through Deshiman's dazed head before the reactor's containment field finally failed was how depressingly fast a well-planned mission could turn to absolute shit. Edvard was nearly parallel with the Lancelot now, moving as fast as the Euterpe could manage when he gave the stalking mech one last kiss with his light laser before another building split between them. The Lancelot continued forward at an easy pace, more than happy to play hide-and-seek with the lighter mech as they wound their way through the streets, confident in the massive weight disparity. It rotated its torso to bring its guns to bear where the Euterpe would be when it passed the buildings, but Edvard had other plans. As the Euterpe entered the obscuring shelter of steel and concrete, he pivoted away from it with a step and slammed the mech's leading foot hard against a rising embankment of excavated earth, punching the Euterpe's jump jets as he twisted its torso as far as it could traverse. The city's mech techs had humored most of the modifications he and his team requested. They were minor alterations that could easily be undone, and the techies well understood that retired combat pilots carried with them their own bag of quirks. With only a handful of UrbanMechs available for defense, and Agriform unwilling to deploy its own mechs until the manufacturing plants arrived, they were more than willing to make a few non-standard adjustments to better fit the UMs to their operators' grips. When it came to the changes Edvard wanted for his own mech's jump jets, however, the techies were a little more resistant. An angry groan and shiver of protesting metal shot up the Euterpe's right leg as it took the bulk of the 30 tons at full tilt, and Edvard was crushed into a seat. Mech's jump jets pushed Edvard towards the buildings, and he used the momentum to swing the ungainly metal beast around in the direction it had come. The rear of its autocannon grazed the apartment's exterior, pulling a furrow through the third floor's facing. A trio of ruby-red beams speared through where he should have been. Edvard's world went mute and dark as he cut all sound in the cockpit, all indicator lights, and most of the Academy's HUD overlay with the flip of a jury-rigged switch bolted to the console. He emerged from behind the building on the same side he had entered, with his index finger resting on the head of the Euterpe's control stick, the meaty part of his thumb stabilized against its body, the sensitivity of the custom firing stud maxed out, and the autocannon set to single shot. The only thing to distract Edvard's eyes when the Lancelot came into view was a long crack in the Euterpe's armored glass, and the small targeting reticule slaved to the autocannon's muzzle. The Euterpe's pit-band jump jets had been thrust regulated, their exhaust redirected to a shallow 25 degrees below level, eliminating its ability to jump. What it gained, though, was the ability to sprint short distances, turn on a dime, and make long, loping strides that momentarily took it airborne. These abilities, however, were hellish to control and put immense strain on both mech and pilot. Edvard found his target. During a single, gliding, jump jet-facilitated stride of the Euterpe, he rolled his hand 3 times in blinding succession, each time tickling the firing stud with his middle finger before tapping the control stick with his thumb. The autocannon kicked, adjusted, kicked again, adjusted again. The last kick hit just as the Euterpe landed, the shock spoiling the accompanying correction. The first heap round cracked the top of an armor plate under the Lancelot's right arm. The second shattered it. The third shredded an array of myomer muscle bundles. Edvard cut the jump jets, slammed back in the opposite direction of travel when the Euterpe landed again, was smashed about again, and started backpedaling. He watched the enemy mech's right arm go limp as it vanished once more behind the building. Edvard flipped the cutoff switch back, and the cockpit filled once more with light and sound. The Euterpe's movements were sluggish. His eyes flicked to a screaming status indicator. His fancy footwork had nearly crippled the little mech's left leg. Not that it mattered much. The Lancelot's PPC was already tracked and charging as it strafed out behind the building and into view, and Edvard could feel the other pilot's fingers against the laser's firing studs. Spencer couldn't believe what just happened. He caught the movement in his rear camera and could scarcely process the maneuver. UrbanMechs weren't supposed to dance. Whoever the hell was piloting that damn UM was an absolute menace. The moment Spencer felt his Lancelot's right arm and large laser go limp, he knew he had to gamble and end the fight immediately. Weight and weapon disparity be damned, he had no room to maneuver and had already been stuck once in a blind alley of concrete and steel. He kept the mech's momentum, spun the torso so it faced the only spot the Urbie could possibly be after the stunted pulled, and prepped for a full salvo of his remaining weapons. Either he'd hit the aggravating trash can and cut it in half, or he'd miss and risk the humiliation of being picked apart by the unerring aim of that damned autocannon. When the apartment's rightward crawl revealed the UM's backward stumble, the mech was in his crosshairs, and the remaining PPC in mid-charge. He delayed firing the Lancelot's lasers only long enough for them to strike in tandem with the PPC. Unfortunately for Spencer, that delay, however fleeting, was still too long. As his fingers came down on the firing studs and the PPC flared brilliantly to life, the mech was struck by a triple broadside of SRMs. The beams of coherent light and crackling stream of charged particles tore their way harmlessly through roadways as the Lancelot was twisted off its feet. Lottie Kempers stomped over from the burning building that had hid her heat signature. She was not what you would call a patient person, and the period of passivity the ambush required of her had done little to calm her nerves. She stood over the Lancelot, glowering down at the smoldering wreck. The bastard Urbies didn't even have hands! She roared in frustration, unable to do more than kick impotently at the fallen, burning mech. Seething, she cycled new rounds into her 3 SRM launchers and ran a quick check for jams before stalking off after Edvard. Lottie missed her pillager. Hoskins should have pulled out the moment Jasper failed to respond. That his team had already engaged ground troops was irrelevant. There was ample time for them to disengage and fall back, disappearing into the wooded foothills before Euterpe could organize a proper response. They'd be off-world before nightfall. Without continuous situational awareness, the mission had a high degree of failure. Resistance was expected to be low, but in the long history of blood and pain and death that was his life, Hoskins knew expectations were rarely met. In and out, a smash and grab job. No casualties, no wrecked mechs. Nice and simple. Hoskins wasn't supposed to be there. His mission was very much off the books, and he could not afford to tangle with local security in an extended firefight. Now, they were all dead. Hoskins tapped his foot absently as his gaze moved between the external monitors and the Enforcer's canopy. There were 4 of them. The urban mech in front of him, an R-60, had a partially buckled leg and was scored by laser fire and the glancing hits of heat rounds, but was otherwise fully functional. 2 others bore more considerable scars. An R-60L missing most of its frontal armor, and an R-68 with a smashed pulse laser hanging loosely by a bundle of power cables. The 4th one, an R-27, was a walking corpse. 2 of its 3 SRMs had cooked off, tearing most of the mech's right side away and exposing the pilot to open air. The UM had been launched across the street and through a spiderweb of steel girders. Not only had the pilot survived, but the UM was able to right itself, stumble out of the twisting steel, and shamble back into the fight. And here was Hoskins, sitting in a pool of his own sweat, his Enforcer unmarked by laser, heap, or missile despite the pain he dished out. It was a setup. The whole mission. They knew he'd take the bait. They also wanted him alive. That much was clear. They hadn't tried disabling his mech at the risk of injuring or killing him. Whoever these people were, Hoskins' life had real value to them, likely as a bargaining chip with Tassagar, if he was being honest with himself. Which was just fine. It meant they'd keep him alive at least until they dealt with his boss, which might be long enough for him to make an escape and maybe figure out how the hell they'd set all this up once he found out who was behind this. No point worrying about what might happen afterwards just yet when news of his little escapade got back to the boss. Hoskins was sure he'd still be more than useful enough to avoid a forced and early retirement. Pretty sure, at least. He wasn't dead yet. That was good enough for now. The mech warrior pulled off the heavy neuro helmet and undid the harness holding him in. He popped the top hatch and climbed out, a wave of cool air washing over him and bringing with it the mixed scent of floral grass and burning rubble. He rose with a smile, both hands held up as he stood on the mech's head. Being a prize brought with it a certain peace of mind. He waited to see which of the UMs would accept his surrender. The R-60's top hatch slowly swung up. A man, naked to the waist, climbed out. It took a moment for Hoskins' eyes to focus on the pilot. His smile faltered. He knew the face. It was the face of a dead man. A man he had watched die with his own eyes. There came a tug in Hoskins' chest. He looked down at it and the spreading red that ate through his thin shirt. He looked back up at the figure across from him. Hoskins hadn't seen him draw the pistol. Even death, it seemed, couldn't slow Jones's hand. Hoskins took a step, stumbled, and pitched forward off his mech. It would have been nice if they had left some buildings standing. Governor Richardson watched as a pair of small industrial mechs sorted through the large pile of rubble. One was focused on extracting steel beams, cutting them into short lengths and stacking them like cordwood for recycling, while the other loaded low-bed haulers with chunks of reinforced concrete for processing. This was the last of 2 sites still to be cleared and the grounds analyzed before plans for a rebuild could begin. When Agriform reached out to Richardson 3 years ago with an investment proposal to build a new Myanmar facility for their agromechs, the governor had quite the laugh. Why would anyone want to invest in a peripheral backwater like Calliope? And for such specialized chem-industrial manufacturing? Of course he agreed on the spot, if only to humor them until they realized how terrible an idea it was and tried to backpedal. Richardson's disposition had changed the following week when the first installment of C-bills had been deposited. Sir, the governor turned away from the sedan's window and cordoned-off construction site across the street. His driver was watching him in the rearview mirror. Yes, Millbrook? Best not to be late, sir. The governor nodded absently before turning back to the reclamation activities. The pace of construction had been exceptionally rapid. Agriform had sent their own engineers to oversee the works, but otherwise left it to Richardson to organize regional resources to conduct the actual construction. All new civil infrastructure needed to be built out from Euterpe's existing boundaries and into the surrounding countryside. Roads and underground services spread out like hoarfrost, while foundations pockmarked the once smooth fields. While it would take a decade or more for the facilities to be fully operational, Agriform was intent on having the in-ground resources in place as soon as possible, stubbing out power, water, and communication lines at foundation edges so they could wire and pipe the empty shells of buildings as and when they were needed. It was a prodigious upfront expense, but Richardson could understand the reasoning. He also understood that the civil costs were likely marginal compared to the chem-industrial ones. Not only were the production plants themselves certain to be absurdly valuable, with the added ongoing expense of specialized technicians to operate them, but so too would be the cost of shipping everything from the inner sphere to the ass end of nowhere. To date, the only off-world resources that Agriform had shipped in were a few civil engineers. Everything else was local. And even the engineers weren't anything special, just paid lackeys to make sure the money was spent appropriately and that everything was done to spec. Governor Richardson could feel his driver's eyes still on him. All right, Millbrook, let's greet the new pilots. The chauffeur eased the car away from the curb. One of the construction crew across from them waved. Richardson waved back. It wasn't entirely true, though. Agriform had also sent Richardson a few retired mech pilots to protect their assets. The governor shivered at the recollection. Something wasn't right about that crew. He didn't know what pit of hell and misery Agriform dug them out of, but quiet and well-mannered as they were scarred in ways he couldn't imagine. Richardson shivered again and pushed the bastard mech jockeys out of his mind. Still, debris piles gave way to cleared lots and, as the sedan approached the old city limits, new construction. Agriform pulled out when their man on the ground messaged them with a high-priority Comstar communique shortly after the shooting stopped. Emergency services were still putting out fires when the governor's office received a "We regret to inform you" letter. The corporation acknowledged their liabilities and responsibilities, which Richardson had not expected. Calliope could keep the balance of C-bills from the last progress of work deposit, which were modest, as well as a claim to the infrastructure already installed, which, for a frontier world, were significant. The buildings couldn't be salvaged and the roadways needed work, but the underground services, which formed the bulk of the expenses Agriform had accrued to date, were in near perfect condition. The only compensation that Agriform requested were any mechs their pilots had captured or destroyed, plus the bodies of the pilots as salvage and spoils of war. As this was part of their contract, Richardson was required to oblige. Even if it wasn't, he was in no position to deny them so long as their own pilots were still lurking about. Richardson flipped through the files of the replacement mech pilots that had arrived that morning. The UrbanMechs' original pilots had been reassigned when Agriform moved in, and found work off-world when it was clear Jones's crew were more than capable of protecting both the project and Euterpe. The new pilots were part of a pool suggested by the corporation itself. All experienced fighters, all young with families that could help fill out the new city district. The sedan stopped before the check-in gate at the modest airport, where the two guards craned their necks out of the booth, smiled at the governor who smiled back, and waved them through. Still, Richardson crushed the concerns that had been nagging at him since the attack. It didn't matter that none of it added up. It didn't matter that the industrial sector he had been tasked to build resembled a tortuous, claustrophobic maze more than anything remotely functional. It wasn't any concern of his if, lurking behind Agriform and its questionable munificence, were corporate and house forces that beggared his little world to insignificance. He knew a payoff when he was offered one. Richardson had gambled his city needlessly in a fit of humor, and was humbled that it had survived. His people were safe, and that's all that mattered. Millbrook opened the car door. Governor Richardson stepped out, leaving the files on his seat. He straightened his tie, adjusted his cufflinks, and forced all thoughts of interstellar intrigue from his mind. With a sure and steady stride, the governor of Calliope put on his warmest smile and strode towards the airport's small, well-appointed hotel and lounge to greet Euterpe's newest citizens. Before starting this project, I'd never done any wet blending. Studying a new hobby skill by practicing it to the exclusion of all the rest for days on end is not something I'd recommend, but it certainly works. Wet blending is more than just mashing paints together on a model while they're still wet, particularly if you want to be efficient at it. There's a trick to learn in the particular back and forth process between applying and mixing colors, as well as a stroke pattern based on the shape and direction of the blend. As someone who hates futzing with a paint job, figuring this trick out and committing it to muscle memory is a must if I'm going to use it as a regular part of my painting process. It'll require a lot more practice, but the potential efficiency gains are fairly large. Originally, I had planned on using the loaded brush technique, but I found the technique too finicky on all the small panels, and the results were wildly inconsistent. The Urby's small panels made it challenging to get high-value contrast in the blends, with the final edge and point highlights dominating the end result. I do like the finished model, though I do think the blends would be much more impactful on larger models such as Tau battlesuits. I'm not sure how I feel about heavy-bodied acrylics. Outside of wet blending or bulk terrain painting with cheaper paints, I can't see myself using them. The consistency isn't pleasant, they thin awkwardly, and even while thin they lay and dry thicker than our normal hobby paints. The main reason I chose to use it for this project was because I wanted to ensure proper blending for the Zorn palette. Unless they're single pigment, our normal hobby paint colors don't always mix the way we think they should. Imagine my surprise when I mixed Vallejo's Model Air Armor Brown with a bit of white to create a light brown highlight for my bolt action DAK army and got a blue-gray instead. The color works, but it was unintuitive. Artist-grade heavy-body acrylics were the most accessible option I had, and as it turned out, were perfect for wet blending. The Zorn palette is a well-known restricted palette in the art world, or a palette that uses a limited number of paints. While there are minor variations based on the particular flavor of colors used, carbon black versus Mars black for instance, the primary paints are yellow ochre, a fairly punchy red, cadmium red medium in my case, black, and white. you can see from the color chart I made that, despite the handful of paints used, you can produce quite a range. You can find a link to the original chart I based mine on in the video description. Though there are no explicitly cool colors, some of the grays do read as having a blue hue when surrounded by all the warmth of reds, yellows, and oranges. I took a fairly straightforward approach to the palette for this project and wouldn't mind dipping into it again in the future with something a bit more complex. As I planned to use only a handful of colors, I pre-mixed what I needed into dedicated paint tubs to guarantee consistency, labeling the tops to match my color chart. The reference art that inspired the color scheme I found recently while staying at an Airbnb. The owners had a coffee table book called Art Deco, The Golden Age of Graphic Art and Illustration, which I spent a good chunk of the trip reading. As luck would have it, I found a beautiful piece by Euterpe that just happened to fit the Zorn palette, while the smooth, mostly linear gradients of Cassandra's travel advertisement posters gave me a technique to develop. If you're looking for inspiration in your own painting ventures, you could do worse than picking up a few art books. Most thrift and secondhand stores are littered with hardcover coffee table books whose massive, full-color pages offer excellent reference material. Not just traditional canvas paintings, but sculptures, glazed pottery, period decor pieces, and general antiquing all provide sources of inspiration. As for the Battletech miniatures, they're fun little models. The detail isn't nearly as crisp as I'd like, and there are a few mold line issues, but the material is of reasonable quality. As game pieces, they're solid. I don't really have room in my schedule to add another game at the moment, so it'll be a while yet before I paint anything explicitly for the tabletop. However, Thunderhead Studios has some lovely retro-tech mech STLs that are free to download that I'd like to paint at some point, and I'm always on the lookout for old-school metal models like Ral Partha's Battletech line. Unfortunately, due to the pressures of the holiday season, I wasn't able to complete the entire lance of mechs, nor the terrain I intended to go with it. Rest assured, however, that they will get done and that I'll post photos of them, as well as update the thumbnail when I do. As you could probably tell by the length of this piece, I had a lot of fun writing this story. My only exposure to Battletech so far has been to the early volumes of the Legends novel collection, which I picked up when Humble Bundle ran a pair of sales a few years back. Thankfully, the Battletech community has a rigorously curated database in sarna.net, which was a massive assistance to me. I tried to remain on the periphery of the lore so as not to get myself into too much trouble canon-wise, while still adding a bit of reasonable novelty. I imagine passive RAM padding is still a thing in the future, and that at least a handful of foolhardy mech techs tried at some point to turn jump jets into afterburners. I tried to select mechs that were available during the Succession Wars, though I understand it might be a bit of a stretch to have 4 different UrbanMech variants in one spot. Particularly the R68, whose MRM wasn't created until well after the Succession Wars ended. However, as this is what came in the Lance Force pack, I'm more than willing to allow a bit of rubberiness to the story. Thank you to my wife Kelsey for her rage-fueled performance as Lottie Kempers. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe. If you have any suggestions, questions, or feedback on anything you've seen in this episode, please comment below. That's it for today. See you next time.